Welcome. You've joined us for a personalized deep dive. Today, we're getting straight into how Ireland's doing.
Yeah, looking at the economy, the environment.
Exactly. Based on the latest figures from the Central Statistics Office, it's their Measuring Ireland's Progress 2023 report.
Right.
Think of this as your quick way to grasp the key shifts from last year.
And it covers a lot, doesn't it? GDP, jobs, emissions, waste.
It really does. Our goal is simple. Pull out the most important bits, maybe some surprising insights, without, drowning everyone in data.
Let's try and make sense of what these numbers really mean.
Okay, let's jump into the economy first. GDP seems like the obvious place to start.
Always is.
And there's this huge surge, right? From about 183 billion in 2013 way up to over 520 billion in 2022.
Massive growth.
But then there's a dip in 2023 back down to 510 billion. What's the key thing to understand there?
Well, that decrease is definitely noteworthy, but you have to see it against that backdrop of, frankly, extraordinary growth beforehand.
Especially that huge jump in 2015 everyone talks about.
Exactly. Now let's bring in gross national income, GNI. That also grew substantially, from 154 billion to 388 billion.
Okay.
But here's the interesting bit. GNI as a share of GDP actually went down.
Down. From what to what?
From about 84% down to 76%. So the whole pie, GDP, got much bigger, but the slice representing income directly available to Ireland, well, it didn't quite keep pace.
Right, so we're producing more, but proportionally less of that value is sticking around as national income. That makes sense.
Uh-huh.
And then there's this other measure, modified gross national income, GNI. Remind us quickly what that's for.
Yeah, GNI or GNI star, it's basically trying to filter out those big globalization effects, the multinational accounting things that can really inflate Ireland's GDP. Gives a clearer view of the underlying domestic economy.
Got it. And how did GNI do?
Similar story. It rose from 138 billion to around 291 billion.
It's still growing.
Still growing, absolutely. Yeah. But its share of GDP, that fell even more steeply, from over 75% down to just 57%.
Wow, 57%. So that really highlights how much of our headline GDP figure is tied up in those global factors.
It does. A big chunk of that output isn't directly feeding back into income generated within the core Irish economy. It's a really important distinction to make.
Okay, so Ireland looks like an economic giant by GDP, but maybe GNI gives a more grounded view of the national income.
I think that's a fair way to put it.
Yeah.
What about per person, though? GNI per capita?
Right. Does that show improvement for the average person?
It does, yeah. GNI per capita went up pretty solidly, from just under 30,000 in 2013 to over 55,000 in 2023.
That's quite a jump.
It is. You do see that little dip in 2020, though.
Ah, the pandemic effect.
Clearly. But it bounced back well afterwards. So, on average, income available within the Irish economy per person has definitely grown over the decade.
Okay. And putting Ireland's total economic size into a European context for 2023, where do we stand? Are we a big player?
In absolute terms, yeah, pretty significant. Ninth highest GDP in the EU 27, that's the 510 billion, and 10th highest GNI, the 388 billion.
So definitely punching above our weight, population-wise.
You could say that. But remember that GNI to GDP ratio we mentioned.
Yeah, you said it was low. Second lowest.
Second lowest, exactly.
Yeah.
Only Luxembourg is lower. Our ratio is 76.2%. And that really just hammers home Ireland's unique position.
Because of all the multinationals and foreign investment.
Precisely. A lot of the economic activity generated here boosts our GDP, but the profits, the returns, they ultimately flow back out. Our economic story is just different.
Very different. And that huge GDP growth in 2015, 24.6%, that was mostly those global factors too, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A massive spike, mainly down to a few large companies moving assets. It shows how volatile that headline GDP can be.
Right.
And then contrast that with 2023, where Ireland actually had the lowest GDP growth in the EU, minus 5.5%.
Yeah.
9 other countries also shrank, mind you, but we were at the bottom that year.
Shows you the swings, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay, what about GDP per person but adjusted for price differences? Purchasing power standards, PPS. Ireland looks amazing on that measure, right?
Exceptionally high, yes.
Yeah.
In 2023, we were at 213 PPS. That's more than double the EE average, 113% above.
Wow.
Again, you see that big jump around 2015. Even if you use GNI per capita in PPS, which, as we said, tries to smooth things out, we're still well above average, 122 PPS, so 22% above the EU average. Still strong. But that GDP figure is clearly inflated by comparison.
Okay, so a complex picture. High output, high productivity per person, but the connection to purely domestic income is unique.
Unique is a good word for it.
Let's switch gears a bit. Government finances. How are we doing on debt?
Actually, this is one of the more positive stories in the report.
Really? Good news.
Yeah, general government debt as a percentage of GDP has fallen dramatically. It was nearly 118% back in 2013.
High.
Very. But by 2023, it was down to 43.3%.
43%? That's a huge drop.
It is. Puts us eighth lowest in the EU 27, a major improvement in the national balance sheet.
And is that still high relative to GNI?
Well, relative to GNI, it's higher, around 76%. That gives another perspective. But the downward trend compared to GDP is undeniable and, frankly, pretty encouraging.
Okay, less debt relative to the economy's size. What about the annual budget? Are we running a surplus or a deficit?
We're running a surplus. In 2023, it was 1.5% of GDP.
Good.
Or 2.6% of GNI. That puts us in a strong position, especially when the EU average was a deficit of 3.5%.
Quite a turnaround from 2013, wasn't it? We had a deficit then.
We did, yeah. A deficit of 6.3% back in 2013. So, yeah, government finances are looking pretty healthy right now.
Lower debt, running a surplus? Sounds more secure. But is the government actually spending less? Or just spending less relative to that bigger economy?
Good question. In absolute terms, spending is up. From about $73 billion in 2013 to nearly $116 billion in 2023.
Okay, so spending more.
Definitely spending more. You see a big jump in 2020, obviously.
Pandemic costs.
Yeah, exactly. But as a percentage of GDP, spending has actually fallen from almost 40% down to under 23%. As a percentage of GNI, it was about 40% in 2023. So yes, total spending increased, but the economy, especially measured by GDP, grew even faster.
Interesting dynamic. Spending more, but it's a smaller slice of that, admittedly unusual, GDP pie.
That's the gist of it.
Now, Ireland's place in the world economy, our current account balance, surplus or deficit?
Big surplus in 2023, 8.1% of GDP. That was the third highest in the EU.
And even higher against GNI.
Yeah, 14.2% of GNI. It basically means we're exporting way more in value goods, services, income from abroad than we're importing or paying out. A strong trading position.
And we know Ireland's a very open economy. Imports and exports are huge relative to our size, right?
Absolutely massive. Imports were over 105% of GDP in 2023. Second highest in the EU.
More than our entire GDP.
Yep. And as a percentage of GNI, it's even wilder, 184.6%.
Wow.
It just shows how incredibly integrated we are globally. We buy and sell huge amounts internationally.
Okay, let's talk about something everyone feels: prices. Cost of living, inflation, what's the story?
Well, between 2020 and 2024, prices here went up 18%, which sounds like a lot.
It feels like a lot.
It does, but actually it was less than the EU average increase of nearly 23%.
Oh, really? Okay.
And the most recent figures for 2024 show a rise of just 1.4%, which was the fifth lowest in the EU.
So inflation is cooling down faster here than elsewhere?
The rate of increase seems to be, yes. But, and this is the crucial bit, our overall price level was already super high.
Ah.
In 2023, prices for consumer goods and services here were 37% above the EU average. Only one country was more expensive.
So even if inflation slows, we're still starting from a very expensive baseline.
Exactly. Things are just generally pricier here compared to most of Europe, even if the recent increases haven't been the absolute highest.
Got it. Okay, let's shift to the job market. Employment. Are more people working?
Yeah, the employment rate is looking healthy, 74% in 2023.
And how does that compare?
That's above the EU average of about 70%, and it's been climbing steadily since 2013. So a growing share of working-age people have jobs.
Any difference between men and women?
There is. Male employment rate was higher, 78.2%, compared to female at 69.9%. So about an 8 percentage point gap there.
Okay. And are we productive? How much output do we get for the hours worked?
Very productive, according to the figures. GDP and PPS per hour worked. Well, it was almost double the EU average in 2023, 97% higher.
Wow. Is that the multinational effect again?
Largely, yes. Even if you try to strip out the foreign sector effect, we're still about 22.5% higher than the EU average. And again, you see a big jump in this measure back in 2015.
Right, that year again.
So yes, a highly productive workforce boosted significantly by those globalized sectors.
High output per hour. What about the flip side, unemployment? People looking for work.
That's another relatively positive indicator. The unemployment rate was 4.3% in 2023.
And that's low.
Pretty low, yeah. Eighth lowest in the EU and well below the EU average of 6.1%. And a massive improvement from 2013 when it was almost 14%.
Huge drops. Similar rates for men and women.
Very similar. 4.4% for men and 4.2% for women. Hardly any difference.
What about people unemployed for a long time? Long-term unemployment.
Also low. Just 1.1% in 2023, again, below the EU average of 2.1%, and way down from where it was a decade ago.
In households where nobody has a job?
That figure's down too. The percentage of people aged 1859 in jobless households was 6.6% in 2023, below the EU average of 8.1% and decreasing since 2013.
So overall, the labor market figures, employment up, unemployment down, look pretty good.
Generally, yes, the indicators point toward a strong labor market currently.
Okay. Now let's tackle a big one, housing, prices, building. What's the data say?
Well, no surprises here. Property prices have rocketed. Nationally, they more than doubled between 2014 and 2024.
Doubled.
Yep, 104.5% increase overall. Dublin saw a bit less, about 77% increase, but the rest of Ireland saw prices jump even more, like 135%.
Wow. Are we building more houses to meet demand?
We are building significantly more, yes. New dwelling completions went from only about 5,500 in 2014 up to over 30,000 in 2024.
That's a big increase in building.
Huge. There were some dips during the pandemic, but the trend is strongly upwards. Particularly apartments completions are up over 1,000% since 2014.
1,000%.
Yeah.
Incredible. But price is still rising fast.
Suggests demand is still outstripping that increased supply in many areas, doesn't it?
It certainly seems that way. Okay, right. Let's switch gears completely now. The environment, increasingly critical. Let's start with the big one. Greenhouse gas emissions. How's Ireland doing there?
This is where the picture gets not. Well, less positive. Quite concerning, actually.
Oh, how so?
In 2022, Ireland's total greenhouse gas emissions were almost 10% higher than in 1990.
Higher, not lower.
Higher, 9.7% higher. And get this, we were one of only 3 EU countries where emissions actually increased over that period.
3, when the rest of the EU is cutting emissions.
Exactly. The EU 27 average saw a decrease of nearly 31% since 1990. We went the other way.
That's stark. What about per person?
Also very high. 11.6 tons of CO2 equivalent per person in 2022. Second highest in the EU. Only Luxembourg emits more per capita.
So we're really lagging behind the rest of Europe on this.
The data clearly shows that, yes, we're not on the right track compared to our neighbors when it comes to cutting our overall greenhouse gas footprint.
What gases are the main culprits? Has the mix changed?
It's interesting. Looking between 2012 and 2022, overall emissions crept up slightly, as we said. CO2 actually went down a tiny bit.
Oh, okay. So what pushed the total up?
Nitrous oxide and methane. Big increases there.
Which mostly come from?
Mostly agriculture.
Yeah.
Those increases basically wiped out the small gains made on CO2. Other gases didn't change much.
Right. Okay, what about air quality? The air we actually breathe day to day. Any improvements there?
There's some better news here. Between 2012 and 2022, emissions of several key air pollutants did go down.
Like what?
Sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter, both PM2.5 and PM10.
Okay, that's good. Any pollutants going up?
Ammonia emissions did increase over that period.
Yeah.
But encouragingly, between 2021 and 2022, all the main air pollutants showed a decrease. So maybe a recent positive turn.
Let's hope so. What about those particulates, PM10 and PM2.5 in our towns and cities? They affect health directly.
Right. For the larger particles, PM10, average levels in Dublin and Cork have generally trended downwards between 2013 and 2023.
Good.
And importantly, neither Dublin nor Cork exceeded the EU daily limit in 2023.
But what about elsewhere?
In larger towns, so those over 15,000 people, the daily limit was exceeded on average 11 days in 2023.
Okay. Still within the annual limit, though.
Yes, Ireland as a whole hasn't breached the EU's 35-day allowance at any monitoring station. For the finer particles, PM2.5, levels have fluctuated, but generally stayed below the EU annual limit everywhere, cities, towns, rural areas over the last decade.
So some progress, especially in cities, but maybe larger towns need more focus.
Seems reasonable to conclude that, yeah. Now, shifting to energy, how efficiently are we using it? Energy productivity.
Right. Are we getting more economic bang for our energy buck?
We are, actually. Ireland's energy productivity hit 26.20 per kilogram of oil equivalent in 2023.
Is that good?
It was the highest in the entire EU 27. So,
yeah.
Yes, very good. We generate a lot of economic output for the energy we consume.
Highest in the EU. Impressive. Did it keep going up?
It actually dipped slightly from 2022, so that's something to keep an eye on. Make sure
Yeah.
it doesn't become a trend.
Okay. What about waste? Are we generating more? Are we managing it better?
We are generating more municipal waste. Total amount went up between 2012 and 2022.
Uh-oh.
But The way we manage it has improved a lot. The amount going to landfill has dropped significantly.
That's crucial. Where's it going instead?
Recovery. So recycling, composting, and energy recovery incineration, that's all increased substantially. The overall recovery rate hit nearly 84% in 2022.
84% recovered, not landfilled. That sounds positive.
It is a definite shift away from just burying rubbish, yes.
How do we stack up against other EU countries on waste?
Well, we generate quite a lot per person, seventh highest in the EU in 2022.
Okay.
Our landfill rate is below the EU average, which is good, but our recycling and composting rates are also below average.
So if we're not landfilling or recycling composting as much as average, what are we doing?
Incineration. Our rate of incineration for energy recovery is the fifth highest in the EU.
Ah, so a lot of that recovery is burning it for energy.
It's a significant chunk, yes. Not just material recycling, it's a mix.
An interesting mix. Okay, transport now. Big sorts of emissions. Car ownership. Freight movement.
Car ownership per 1,000 people actually went up slightly between 2019 and 2023.
Oh.
But we still have one of the lowest car ownership ratios in the EU.
Yeah.
Fourth lowest in 2023.
Okay, so not that many cars per person compared to elsewhere, but how do we move goods?
Well, almost entirely by road.
Almost entirely.
In 2022, 99.3% of inland freight in Ireland was on trucks.
99.3%.
Yep, it's exceptionally high. The EU average is much lower, with rail and waterways playing bigger roles elsewhere.
And here, rail freight is tiny.
Tiny, 0.7%. Inland waterways, basically zero for freight.
Wow. That heavy reliance on road freight must have huge environmental implications.
You'd have to assume so, yes.
Mm.
Emissions, congestion, sustainability.
Oh.
It's a big factor.
Definitely something to think about. What about the types of cars people are buying now? Any shift to cleaner vehicles?
There are definitely trends showing up between 2014 and 2024. New diesel car sales plummeted.
Okay. What's replacing them?
Petrol cars have risen, and hybrids, petrol-electric hybrids have become really popular.
And fully electric cars.
They saw strong growth up to 2023, but then registrations actually dipped slightly in 2024. Plug-in hybrids, though, continued to increase.
So a definite move towards electrification, but maybe hybrids are winning out over pure electric for now.
Looks like it.
Yeah.
Petrol and hybrids still dominate the new car market, but the shift away from diesel is very clear.
Okay. And just quickly, water consumption. Are we using more or less water at home?
The average domestic metered water use actually fell a bit between 2021 and 2022, and it's down slightly overall since 2016. The median use, like the typical household, also fell recently.
Yeah.
But it's slightly up since 2016. So no dramatic changes, perhaps slight improvements in average efficiency.
Right. Okay, that really covers a huge amount of ground, doesn't it?
It certainly does, a real snapshot across the board.
So just to quickly wrap up the key things for everyone listening, we've seen some definite positives, yeah.
Definitely. Government debt coming down significantly, unemployment nice and low.
Strong jobs market overall, but also some tricky areas or interesting shifts.
Like that GDP dip in 2023, the whole complex GDP versus GNI story because of globalization.
Yeah, that's crucial context. And on the environment side.
The greenhouse gas emissions trend is a real worry, being so out of step with the EU.
And that massive reliance on road freight, too.
Exactly. Lots of progress in some areas, big challenges in others.
What's really striking is how interlinked it all is, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, the strong jobs market helps tax revenues, which helps the government balance.
And Ireland's role as that multinational hub affects everything. GDP, GNI, trade balances, maybe even energy productivity.
It's all connected.
So this deep dive really leaves us with some big questions, doesn't it? For you, our listener, to think about.
Like, what are the long-term consequences of our unusual economic structure, so shaped by global forces?
And maybe the biggest one. How on earth does Ireland square continued economic ambition with the urgent need to slash emissions, given where we are now?
That's the multi-billion euro question, isn't it? Big challenges ahead, requiring some really smart thinking and determined action.
Indeed. And if you want to dig even deeper into any of this,
I'd really recommend checking out the original CSO report, Measuring Ireland's Progress 2023. It's all in there. Let's get past the headlines.
Definitely worth a look. We really hope this dive has given you a clearer picture, some valuable insights.
Hope it's been useful.
Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back next time to unpack another complex topic, trying to keep you informed without the overload.